The forgetting came first, a quiet thief in the night of the world's mind. It wasn't like amnesia, a clean void where something used to be. It was a smudge, a blurring at the edges of certainty. People would pause mid-sentence, the name of a lifelong friend suddenly tasting like ash and strangeness on their tongue. Maps began to fray, not with age, but with a creeping inconsistency. Coastal cities that had stood for centuries would appear inland, or not at all, and no one could quite recall which was correct. History became a fluid, unreliable dream. They called it the static, a creeping cognitive decay that whispered a terrible truth: the universe was losing its memory, and humanity was just a footnote in a chapter being erased. Then came the silence. It followed the static like a predator stalking weakened prey. An erasure wasn't an explosion. It was a deep, resonant hum that seemed to well up from the planet's core. And when it faded, a piece of the world was simply gone, not destroyed, not replaced by a crater of glass, but excised from reality with surgical precision. The first was a small town in the Siberian wilderness, vanished overnight. The world dismissed it as a mapping error, a ghost on the satellite feeds. But then it was a section of the Great Barrier Reef, replaced by a perfectly sterile patch of seabed, then the entire city of Buenos Aires. There was no rubble, no dust, no lingering radiation. There was just an unnerving smoothness to the coastline where millions had lived, a scar not on the land, but on the fabric of existence itself. The hum would sound, and a place, along with every person, every object, and every specific memory of it, would cease to have been. The invaders were never seen, for they were not beings in the conventional sense. They were a condition, a law of physics turning cancerous. They had no ships, only the localized reality failures that served as their footprints. They made no demands, offered no ultimatums. They were cosmic purifiers, sweeping away the messy, chaotic noise of life, and their only message was the profound, deafening quiet they left in their wake. Humanity fought back, of course. We fired weapons into the shimmering haze that preceded an erasure event, but the missiles would simply cease to exist mid-flight. We built ontological anchors, massive facilities designed to reinforce reality in a specific location, but the silence treated them like sandcastles before a tide. In 10 years, the population of Earth was reduced by 70%, not through war, but through meticulous, indifferent deletion. The survivors huddled in the last remaining anchored cities, listening to the hum, waiting their turn. The static slowly eating away at who they were, what they had lost, until all that remained was a primal, nameless dread. Kyle was a curator of ghosts. In the deepest, most shielded level of the Neo-Denver anchor, he maintained the archive, a cold, sterile vault where the last vestiges of the forgotten world were stored. He wasn't a soldier or a scientist. He was a psychic janitor, a man whose mind was resilient enough to look at a photograph of the Eiffel Tower without suffering a cognitive hemorrhage. Most people couldn't do that anymore. The paradox of seeing something that had never existed was too much for the human mind to bear. For Kyle, it was just Tuesday. His job was to preserve the data, to reinforce the memories of a world that reality itself was trying to forget. He walked the silent halls, past displays of artifacts that felt alien and impossible. A New York Yankees baseball cap, a bottle of scotch from a distillery in a Scottish valley that was now just empty, windswept rock, a child's worn teddy bear from a suburb of London that had never been built. His own loss was a wound that would not scar over. He hadn't seen his wife and daughter die. He hadn't buried them. One morning, he had simply woken up feeling a hollow ache in his soul, a sense of profound absence he couldn't name. For weeks, he'd walked through his life with the phantom limb of a family haunting him. It was only when he found a faded photograph tucked into the spine of an old book, a picture of him, a woman with warm, laughing eyes, and a little girl with a gap-toothed grin on a beach that no longer existed, that the static in his own head cleared for a horrifying moment. He remembered them. He screamed for 3 days. That photograph was his most treasured and hated possession. A tangible piece of a life reality had stolen from him, and the source of the resilience that made him perfect for his job. He could look at the impossible and not break, because he was already broken. The summons came in the form of General Eva Rostova, a woman whose face looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in the frost. She was the commander of the Remnant, the tattered remains of the world's unified military, and she didn't waste time with pleasantries. "The erasures are accelerating," she said, her voice a low, gravelly hum that vibrated through the cold air of the archive. "The Albuquerque anchor fell an hour ago. We didn't even hear the hum. It just stopped broadcasting. Our anomalists believe the final cascade is beginning. The planet's core resonance is destabilizing. Soon, it won't be cities. It will be the whole damn thing." Kyle ran a hand over his tired face, the gesture doing nothing to wipe away the exhaustion that lived in his bones. "So, this is it." Then, the big quiet. Rostova shook her head, a single, sharp motion. "Not yet. There's one card left to play. A weapon we never dared to use. Project Chimeri." Kyle froze, his blood turning to ice water in his veins. Chimera wasn't a weapon. It was a sin, a dark secret from the early days of the static, when humanity was desperate enough to break the laws of God and physics in equal measure. "No," he whispered. "You can't. He's not stable. No one has been able to interface for years. Rostova's lips pressed into a thin, grim line. "Subject 0 isn't a he, Kyle. And we don't need to interface. We need to wake her up. And you're the only one who can do it without your brain running out of your ears. You were her keeper. Your psychic signature is the only one she's keyed to accept." The word keeper landed like a physical blow. That's what they had called him, the man tasked with soothing the nightmares of a living god, the psychic janitor for a weaponized soul. The guilt was a physical thing, a tumor in his chest he'd carried for 15 years. "I can't," he said, the words barely audible. "She'll tear my mind apart. She'll tear everything apart." Rostova stepped closer, her eyes boring into his. "The world is already being torn apart, piece by piece. Her chaos is at least our own. Theirs is just nothing. I'm not asking you, Kyle. I'm telling you. We're going to the cradle. You're going to dive. You're going to find her in whatever hell she's living in, and you're going to bring her back. Or everything you're preserving in this tomb will be as real as a fairy tale." The cradle wasn't a place on Earth. It was a place in it. A facility carved into the planet's mantle, 5 miles beneath the Pacific floor, accessible only by a thermic elevator that took 6 hours to descend. The heat and pressure at that depth were so immense that they created a natural insulation against reality fluctuations. It was the only place on the planet the silence couldn't touch. As the elevator descended, the world above seemed to melt away, replaced by the groaning of stressed metal and the deep, geological hum of the earth. Kale was flanked by two of Rostova's commandos, their faces grim and unreadable behind their helmets. The final chamber was a sphere of polished obsidian, vast and silent. In the center, suspended in a web of shimmering energy conduits and cryogenic tubing, was the cage. It wasn't a prison of bars and steel, but a complex, beautiful machine of chrome and light, an ontological amplifier designed to both contain and focus an immense power. And inside it, floating in a translucent gel that refracted the chamber's low light, was a woman. Subject 0, Ilara. She looked no older than she had the last time he'd seen her, her body frail and pale, her face serene in its long slumber, a silver circlet of neural interfaces woven into her dark hair. She looked like a sleeping princess from one of the fairy tales Rostova had mentioned. But Kale knew what slept behind those closed eyelids. Not a princess, but a storm. A mind so powerful it could impose its will on the base code of the universe, but so fractured it couldn't distinguish dream from reality. They had found her as a child, a girl whose nightmares literally came true, whose tantrums could curdle milk and stop clocks for miles. Project Chimera hadn't created her power, it had tried to harness it. They built the cage to amplify her innate ability, turning her from a psychic anomaly into a reality-bending weapon. A shouter, someone who didn't fire guns, but could simply insist with the full force of her mind that a target was no longer there. And reality, for a moment, would obey. The cost was her sanity. To keep the weapon from turning on its creators, they had put her to sleep, and Kyle had been her warden, his mind the only anesthetic that could soothe her tormented dreams. He had spent years walking through the broken landscapes of her subconscious, calming the monsters she created, a gentle lie in the face of her terrible truth. He had been the one to sing her the final lullaby before they put her into deep stasis. "She's ready," said a voice. Dr. Eris Thorne, the lead anomalist and the architect of Ilara's cage, stood at a console, his face illuminated by the green glow of biometric readouts. "Her neural activity is stable, but she's buried deep. The dreamscape will be chaotic. You remember the protocols." Kyle nodded, his throat dry. The protocols were simple. Find the core of her consciousness, the girl in the garden as they used to call her, and guide her back to the surface. Avoid the phantoms. Ignore the echoes. And whatever you do, don't believe what you see. He strapped himself into the interface chair, a cold, metallic throne wired directly into the cage. The commandos gave him a wide berth, their unease a palpable force in the room. They knew the stories of the last keeper who tried this, a man whose mind had been so thoroughly scrambled he'd spent the rest of his short life speaking in binary and trying to claw his own eyes out. The helmet descended, and the world dissolved into darkness and the sound of his own breathing. Initiating the dive, Thorne's voice said, distant and tinny. "Good luck, keeper." Then, a jolt, not of electricity, but of transposition. Kyle was no longer in his body. He was falling through a sea of static and broken code, fragments of Ilara's dreams whipping past him like shrapnel. He saw forests with trees made of weeping glass, oceans that burned with cold fire, cities that folded in on themselves like paper. This was the periphery, the buffer zone her subconscious had created. He pushed through it, focusing on the memory of a song, a simple folk melody he used to hum to her when the nightmares got bad. It was his anchor, his key. He broke through into a landscape of gray sand under a sky of swirling, bruised purple. In the distance, a twisted skeletal version of the Eiffel Tower clawed at the clouds. Phantoms made of shadow and regret drifted across the dunes, their faces blurred, their whispers promising oblivion. This was her pain, her loneliness given form. He ignored them, focusing on his song, a single point of warmth in the cold desolation. He walked for what felt like an eternity, the gray sand sucking at his boots, the whispers of the phantoms trying to hook into his own guilt, his own loss. He saw his wife's face in the swirling clouds, heard his daughter calling his name on the wind. It was a trap. He knew it. He closed his eyes, humming the tune louder, forcing the real memories to the surface. The photograph in his pocket, a psychic shield. Finally, he saw it. A small, walled garden in the middle of the wasteland, the only place where color existed. Green grass, blooming roses, a single willow tree, and, sitting beneath it, a young girl with dark hair, her back to him, humming a familiar tune. The core. Ilara. He stepped into the garden, the oppressive atmosphere of the dreamscape lifting, replaced by a fragile peace. Ilara, he said softly. The girl didn't turn. You're not real, she whispered. You're just another dream. They all are. I'm real, Kyle said, taking another step. I'm Kyle. I came to wake you up. We need you. She finally turned, and his breath caught in his throat. It was her, but her eyes were pits of swirling darkness, galaxies of terror and power. Wake up, she said, her voice a discordant harmony of a child and a storm. I am awake. This is what the world is now. Quiet, empty, just like they want. A tremor ran through the dreamscape. The garden walls began to crumble. The gray sand outside was turning to black, viscous ooze. They can't have it. Ilara, Kale pleaded, reaching out. You can stop them. You can shout back. Every time I shout, I break something. She hissed, clutching her head. I break me. This time, we'll shout together, he said, his voice firm, pushing his own certainty, his own rage. Into the psychic space between them, he showed her the image from his mind, the photograph of his family, the raw, burning agony of his erased loss. They took them from me. They're trying to take everything. You are not a weapon. You are our voice. And it's time to get loud. For a moment, she stared at the memory, at his pain. A flicker of something ancient and powerful sparked in those dark eyes. She stood up, the form of the little girl shimmering, aging, becoming the woman in the cage. She reached out and took his hand. It will hurt, she whispered. Let it, he answered. The moment their minds truly connected, reality screamed. In the control room, alarms blared as every system redlined. Thorn yelled for his team to reinforce the containment field. Outside, in the world above, the silent, invisible wave of the erasure event that was about to consume Neo Denver, the final human bastion, froze in place. It didn't retreat. It was met with a wall of pure, defiant existence. A thought, amplified into a physical law, that simply said, no. A wave of soundless sound, an ontological roar, washed over the planet. For the first time in a decade, the silence was answered. Back in the cradle, Kale grit his teeth, the psychic feedback of fire in his skull. But he held on. Ilara opened her eyes. They were no longer black voids, but blazing supernovas of impossible, terrifying light. The war for reality had begun. The backlash was not a physical force, but a metaphysical one. When Kyle's consciousness slammed back into his body in the interface chair, it felt like being born and dying in the same instant. The air in the cradle tasted of ozone and paradox, of moments that had almost happened and were now forcibly prevented. Every nerve ending screamed with the memory of the connection, the raw, unshielded power of a mind that treated reality as a suggestion. He tore the helmet off, gasping, his heart hammering a frantic, discordant rhythm against his ribs. Across the obsidian chamber, alarms shrieked like dying animals as consoles sparked and failed. The energy conduits surrounding the cage pulsed with a violent residual light, and the cryogenic gel had boiled away into a thick, acrid mist. In the center of it all, Ilara had fallen to her knees on the platform, her frail body trembling uncontrollably, not from cold, but from the sheer, deafening shock of being. She was awake, and the universe was screaming back. Dr. Thorne and his team scrambled to stabilize the containment field, their faces a mixture of terror and triumph. General Rostovas, however, was unnervingly still. She watched Ilara not as a person, but as a gun that had just been fired for the first time, her eyes calculating the blast radius. Kale stumbled from the chair, his legs weak, and made his way to the platform, pushing past a frantic medic. He knelt in front of Ilara, ignoring the hum of a power he could still feel radiating from her skin. "Ilara, can you hear me?" Her head lifted slowly. Her eyes, no longer burning novas, were wide with a terrifying, childlike wonder and a deep, ancient pain. She looked at her own hands, turning them over and over as if they were alien things. "It's so loud," she whispered, her voice hoarse from 15 years of disuse. "Everything, the metal in the walls, the air, the light, it all has a name, a story. It won't stop." Kyle understood immediately. Her mind, no longer shielded by the dreamscape, was experiencing the unfiltered totality of existence. Every atom, every particle, every quantum possibility was a voice shouting in the choir of reality. "Focus on me," he said, his voice low and steady. He reached out, not to touch her, but to project a sliver of his own consciousness, a small, quiet room in the roaring cathedral of her mind. "Just my voice. Block out the rest. You know how." She flinched, but then her trembling eased slightly as she latched on to his psychic presence. He was her anchor, the one solid thing in a sea of overwhelming sensation. Rostova's boots clicked on the platform behind them. "Report, Doctor." Thorne, wiping sweat from his brow, tapped at a flickering console. "The erasure wave over Neo-Denver has dissipated, not retreated. General, it's gone, as if it never was." The shout, for lack of a better term, propagated globally. We're seeing cascade effects. The static is in retreat. People are remembering things, places, faces. The psychic pressure that has been strangling this planet for a decade has been broken. "Then it worked," Rostova said, a grim satisfaction in her tone. How soon can she do it again? Kale stood up, turning to face her, placing himself between the general and Ilara. She's not a cannon. General. Look at her. We almost lost her. I almost lost myself. Loss is the currency of this war. Kyle. Rostova retorted, her gaze unwavering. And you just proved we can finally afford to buy something other than a grave. We need to know what she can do, how to aim her, and how to reload. She isn't a what. She's a who. Kyle shot back, his voice rising. Her mind is the battlefield. If we push her too hard, she'll break. And she'll take the whole damn planet with her when she does. Then you will train her, Rostova commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. You're her keeper. Keep her stable. Keep her focused. But make no mistake, she is the only weapon we have left. And I will use her. The alternative is oblivion. Get her cleaned up and bring her to the briefing room. We have a war to win. The days that followed were a delicate, terrifying balancing act. Ilara was moved from the cradle to a shielded suite in the upper levels of the anchor. For her, the world was a sensory minefield. The taste of water was a symphony of geology and time. The touch of a simple cotton sheet was a complex history of agriculture and industry. Kyle stayed with her, teaching her to build walls in her mind, to filter the cacophony of reality into something manageable. He was the only one she trusted, the only one whose thoughts didn't feel like an assault. He'd read her old storybooks, their simple narratives a comfort against the chaotic, multi-threaded story of the universe she was constantly perceiving. In these quiet moments, he saw the person buried beneath the power, a woman frozen at the age she was when they put her to sleep, full of fear and a desperate curiosity about a world she had only ever known through dreams. But the war did not wait. The silence, having been challenged, changed its tactics. It wasn't erasing places anymore. It was erasing minds. It began subtly, a new form of the static, more aggressive and targeted. People in the anchor would suddenly stop, their eyes glazing over as their personal histories, their loves, their identities were meticulously deleted from their brains, leaving behind empty, breathing husks. They called it the hush. The enemy wasn't just erasing the board anymore, it was taking the pieces. Rostova saw this as an escalation that demanded a response. She brought Kyle and Ilara to the command center, a vast chamber where a holographic map of the world shimmered, pockmarked with red zones indicating hush outbreaks. The silence is adapting, Rostova stated, pacing before the map. It's targeting consciousness directly. We need to strike back, not defensively. We need to go on the offensive. Thorn, looking even more haggard than before, pointed to a blinking icon in orbit. Our long-range scans have detected a focal point, a convergence of the reality-distorting energy. It's not a ship. It's a node, a weak point, perhaps, a place where the silence is more tangible. If we could erase it. We can, Rostova said, looking directly at Ilara. Ilara, who stood beside Kyle, looking small and overwhelmed in the vast room, flinched. Aim me, she whispered, the concept foreign and violent to her. How do you aim a thought? That's what he's for, Rostova said, nodding at Kyle. You're the power. He's the lens. Your minds were linked. You will show her the target, Kyle. You will hold her focus and make sure she hits only what we want her to hit. Kyle felt a cold dread wash over him. It was one thing to push back against an impersonal wave of nothingness. It was another entirely to aim a person's soul at a specific point in space and pull the trigger. It could kill her, he said flatly. Doing nothing will kill us all, Rostova countered. This is the war now, not guns and bombs. It's his mind against theirs, our will against its. They prepped for the attempt in a specialized chamber, a smaller version of the cradle's core, designed to channel psychic energy. The target was a ghost, an echo in space where a pre-static communication satellite used to be. The node was hiding in its ontological shadow. Ilara sat in a simple chair, Kyle in another opposite her, their hands clasped. The connection was different this time. It wasn't a desperate dive into a storm. It was a conscious, deliberate merging of their minds. He opened his thoughts to her, showing her the star charts, the coordinates, the telemetry data from Thorn's scans. He built a corridor in their shared mental space, a straight, unwavering path from her mind to the target. He could feel her immense, chaotic power gathering around his focused intent, like an ocean being funneled into a river. It's so far. Her thought echoed in his mind, full of doubt. It's just a place, he sent back, reinforcing the thought with his own conviction. Like any other, you are here. It is there. You just have to decide that there isn't. He felt her take hold of the concept. The air in the chamber grew thick, vibrating with a silent, terrible pressure. The lights flickered. He could feel the universe resisting, the fundamental laws of physics groaning under the strain of her will. Now, he whispered, both aloud and in their shared mind. He felt her push. It was not a scream this time. It was a single, pure, resonant note of absolute negation, a declaration. In the command center, Thorn watched the energy signature of the node vanish from the sensors. "Target is gone," he breathed, a stunned disbelief in his voice. She did it. She actually did it. But in the chamber, the backlash hit Kyle like a physical blow. It wasn't a wave of fire. It was a wave of information, a tidal wave of echoes from the thing they had just erased. The node wasn't just a concentration of energy. It was a thought, a piece of a vast, alien consciousness. And in its final moment, it had screamed its own story back at them. Kyle was thrown from the connection, his mind flooded with impossible geometries, with the cold, patient thoughts of a being that measured time in the death of stars, with a perspective so vast and indifferent it made the silence feel like a child's tantrum. He saw the universe as a canvas, and life as a brief, messy smear of paint that needed to be cleaned. He felt its profound, unshakable certainty that existence was a flaw, and silence was purity. He collapsed to the floor, shaking, the alien thoughts clinging to the edges of his mind like oil. Ilara was slumped in her chair, a thin trickle of blood running from her nose, her eyes wide with the same cosmic horror he had just witnessed. They hadn't just destroyed a target. They had touched the mind of God. Or the devil. He wasn't sure there was a difference. He staggered to his feet and went to her, helping her from the chair. She leaned on him, her strength gone. "Did Johannes see it?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He nodded, unable to speak. "It knows we're here now." "Kyle," she said, her terrified eyes meeting his. "It knows our names." Outside the chamber, Rostova was already planning the next strike. They had a weapon, and it was working. But Kale knew the truth. They hadn't fired the first shot. They had just knocked on the door of a cathedral of silence, and something ancient and vast was finally, slowly, turning its head to look at them. And it was not pleased. The hush intensified, but now it had a voice, a whisper that slithered into the minds of the anchor's residents, a cold, logical susurrus that didn't threaten, but convinced. It told them of the peace of non-existence, the beauty of the clean, quiet void. It was the alien thought Kale had felt, weaponized into a psychic virus, and it was coming for Ilara. It found her in her sleep, not as a nightmare of monsters and shadows, but as a calm, rational voice that sounded like her own. It showed her the pain she caused, the strain of her existence, the chaos she represented. It offered her an escape, a way to finally quiet the screaming of the universe. It offered her the silence. Kyle felt it the moment it happened, a sudden cold spike in the psychic bond they now shared. He raced to her suite to find her sitting on her bed, her eyes open but vacant, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek as she listened to the sweet, poisonous lullaby of oblivion. He grabbed her shoulders, shouting her name, but she didn't respond. He was losing her. He had to go in again, not to wake her, but to fight for her. He closed his eyes, focused his will, and dove headfirst into the serene, beautiful, and utterly lethal trap that had been laid for her mind. Kale didn't fall into Ilara's mind. He was pulled. The sensation was slick and frictionless, a willing slide into a place of unnerving calm. The usual chaotic periphery of her dreamscape was gone, replaced by a perfect, ordered stillness. He stood on a shore of fine, white sand, watching a placid, glass-like sea stretch to a horizon that was a flawless, seamless blend of white sky. There was no sun, no clouds, no wind. The only sound was a faint, melodic hum that seemed to originate from everywhere at once, the song of absolute zero, the music of the void. This was the trap, and it was beautiful. The alien consciousness, which Kyle now thought of as the quiet, hadn't invaded with fire and terror. It had seduced with peace. It had found the deepest, most desperate desire in Ilara's soul, the longing for silence, and had built her a heaven that was also a prison. He saw her in the distance, walking slowly along the water's edge. She wasn't the frightened woman from the waking world, nor the powerful, terrifying shouter. She was serene, her face untroubled, a faint, beatific smile on her lips. She was listening to the hum, and it was healing her, or so she believed. "Ilara," he called out. His voice was a harsh, ugly sound in the profound tranquility, a rock thrown into a still pond. She turned, and for a moment, her serene expression faltered. A flicker of confusion, of pain, crossed her features. "Kyle, what are you doing here? It's not loud anymore. It's finally quiet." "This isn't your quiet, Ilara," he said, walking towards her, his boots making no sound on the pristine sand. "This is its quiet. It's an anesthetic. It's numbing you so it can cut you out of the world without you fighting back." The hum intensified slightly, a subtle shift in pitch that felt like a warning. The glassy sea rippled. "You're the loud one," she said, a hint of the quiet's cold logic creeping into her voice. "You're the one who woke me up. You brought the noise back. The quiet is pure. It doesn't hurt." "Living hurts," Kyle countered, his own voice rising with an anger born of desperation. He projected his own memories at her, not as an attack, but as an offering. He showed her the photograph of his wife and daughter, the ghost of their laughter, the warmth of the sun on a beach that no longer existed. He showed her the ache of his loss, the burning, ragged-edged hole in his life. This is what they take, this messy, painful, beautiful noise. This is what we're fighting for. The serene landscape fractured, the white sky cracked like porcelain, revealing glimpses of the bruised, swirling chaos of her true subconscious beneath. The glassy sea began to churn, turning dark and violent. The hum became a dissonant, angry buzz. Elara cried out, clutching her head as the two realities warred for dominance in her mind. A figure coalesced from the humming air between them. It had no face, no discernible form, just a man-shaped silhouette of pure, shimmering silence, a hole in the visual noise of the dream. It was an avatar of the quiet. She has made her choice. The avatar projected, its thought a wave of cold certainty that washed over Call's mind, threatening to extinguish his own will. She chooses peace. You offer only pain. You call this peace? Cal roared, gesturing to the sterile, empty world around them. This is a morgue. A blank page. Pain is part of the story. It's the ink. The avatar of the quiet turned its featureless head towards him. The story is flawed. The author is flawed. We are the correction. It extended a hand, and the very concept of Cale's existence began to fray at the edges. He felt his memories blurring, his identity thinning out, the seductive logic of the hush whispering that it would be so much easier to simply not be. He was losing. He couldn't fight this thing on its own terms. It was too vast, too old, its will a fundamental constant of the universe. But he wasn't fighting it. He was fighting for her. He broke his gaze from the avatar and looked at Elara, who was on her knees, caught in the psychic crossfire. He poured every last ounce of his own will, his own identity, his own broken, grieving, defiant self into a single, focused thought, a lifeline he threw across the storm. I can't beat it. Elara, but we can. You are not a weapon to be aimed. You're a storm, and storms don't need a target. They just need to break. So break. He felt her seize the thought. He saw the conflict in her eyes, the terror of unleashing her full, untamed power, warring with the instinct to survive. And then she made a choice. She didn't scream. She didn't shout. She opened her mouth and began to sing. It was the folk song Kyle had used to find her, the simple melody that had been his anchor. But now, it was her anchor, too. And as she sang, she poured all the noise she had been trying to suppress into the notes. The song was the taste of water, the feeling of cotton sheets, the history of every atom in the cradle, the fear, the loneliness, the pain, the rage, the chaotic, overwhelming, glorious symphony of life. The dreamscape shattered. The white sand dissolved into a maelstrom of color and sound. The avatar of the quiet shrieked, a sound of pure static and negation as the messy, beautiful song of existence tore it apart. Kyle was blown back, his consciousness tumbling through a hurricane of raw creation as Elara's mind reasserted its own chaotic, vibrant sovereignty. He woke up on the cold floor of her suite, gasping for air. Elara was awake, sitting up on the bed, her eyes clear and fiercely, terrifyingly alive. The psychic virus was gone, burned out by the sheer force of her will. But something had changed. The link between them was stronger, deeper. He didn't just feel her presence, he could almost see the world through her eyes, a shimmering, vibrant tapestry of infinite detail, and he knew, with a chilling certainty, that she could see into him just as clearly. "It's still out there," she said, her voice quiet but resonant with a newfound power. "It wasn't trying to erase me. It was trying to recruit me. It wanted my voice for its choir." In the command center, every screen monitoring the hush outbreaks went dark. The psychic whisper across the anchor ceased. For a moment, there was just stunned silence. Then, the chamber doors hissed open and General Rostova strode in, her face grim. What happened? Kyle stood, helping Alara to her feet. "We met the enemy, and it knows we're not just going to lie down and die." Rostova looked from Kyle to Alara, noticing the change in the latter. Alara no longer looked small or frightened. She stood tall, her gaze steady. The raw power she wielded no longer a burden she carried, but a mantle she wore. "Thorn's team has been analyzing the energy residue from the last shout," Rostova said, her tone all business. "They've traced the source of the silence, not just a node, the central point, the heart of the phenomenon. If it has one, a place in the Oort cloud, a region of absolute preternatural void. We believe that's where its core consciousness, or whatever passes for it, resides." "You want us to hit it," Kyle said. It wasn't a question. "I want you to end it," Rostova corrected. "I want you to take this fight to them. Alara will be the bullet. You, Kyle, will be the rifle, and I am pulling the trigger. But we can't do it from here. The psychic distance is too great. The shot would dissipate." "Doctor," Thorn stepped forward, holding a data slate. "Which is why we've prepared the Odyssey." He brought up a holographic schematic. It was a ship, sleek and skeletal, built around a massive central core that looked disturbingly like a scaled-up version of Ilara's cage. It's not a warship. It's a delivery system, an ontological spear. It has no weapons, minimal life support, and a one-way experimental drive. It's designed to do one thing, get you too close enough to the target to fire one. Final shout. "A one-way drive?" Kyle asked, his stomach tightening. "We don't have the resources or the time for a return journey," Rostova said flatly. "This is it. The final play. You go. You fire. You cut the head off the snake. Either it works, and you save humanity, or it doesn't, and you'll be the first to know. You'll have a small military escort to get you through the inner system, but beyond Saturn, you'll be on your own." It was a suicide mission, a desperate, final gamble, throwing their two most valuable assets into the heart of the void with no expectation of their return. Kale looked at Alara. He expected to see fear, or anger, or defiance. Instead, he saw a quiet, resolute calm. She had faced the quiet in her own mind and had won. The physical distance meant nothing to her now. "When do we leave?" she asked. The journey to the Odyssey, docked in a high-orbit station, was silent. The entire anchor seemed to be holding its breath. Kyle and Alara, flanked by commandos, walked through halls lined with civilians who had come to watch them go. Their faces were a mixture of hope and terror. They were staring at their saviors, their sacrifices. As they boarded the transport shuttle, Kyle looked back at the faces in the crowd. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw a woman with warm, laughing eyes and a little girl with a gap-toothed grin, a ghost of a memory, a phantom from a world that had almost been forgotten. It wasn't a sad thought. It was fuel. It was the reason he was here, the ink for the story he was determined to finish. He strapped himself into the Odyssey, was less a ship and more a needle designed to pierce the veil of reality. Its corridors were sterile, white, and unnervingly silent. The hum of its life support systems deliberately dampened to a near subliminal frequency. The entire vessel was a psychic focusing lens, and its heart was the bridge, a spherical chamber that was an almost perfect replica of Ilara's containment cell in the cradle. Here, two interface chairs sat back to back in the center of the room, surrounded by a holographic projection of the starscape outside. There was no crew, save for Kale, Ilara, and a disembodied, monotone AI named Virgil, whose only function was to manage the ship's trajectory and report on their progress into the abyss. Their escort, a small squadron of remnant gunships, peeled away at the edge of the asteroid belt, their pilots offering solemn, silent farewells as they turned back towards the distant, pale blue dot of Earth. From that moment on, they were utterly, terrifyingly alone. The experimental drive didn't roar to life. It simply engaged. The sensation was profoundly disorienting. Space didn't rush past them in a blur of stars. Instead, the universe seemed to fold around the ship, distances contracting and expanding in nauseating, non-Euclidean ways. They were no longer moving through space, but pulling it around them like a blanket. Virgil's voice, calm and detached, would occasionally break the silence. Approaching the Saturnian plane, all readings nominal. Crossing the heliopause, external reality index is beginning to degrade. Kyle and Ilara spent most of their time on the bridge, a silent, shared vigil. The bond between them had deepened into something beyond simple psychic communication. It was a state of constant, low-level symbiosis. He felt the dull ache in her bones from years of cryogenic suspension. She felt the phantom sting of his grief for his lost family. They were two broken halves of a single desperate hope. As they traveled deeper into the outer dark, the nature of space itself began to change. The stars thinned out, not just becoming more distant, but seemingly less certain. Their light struggling to reach across the growing ontological void. The silence was stronger out here. It was the natural state of the cosmos, the default setting. And they were a tiny, defiant anomaly pushing against it. They began to experience incursions. They weren't attacks, not in a military sense. They were subtle, insidious intrusions into their minds. Kyle would find himself lost in a perfectly lucid memory of a life he'd never lived. A quiet afternoon in a Parisian cafe, the scent of rain on cobblestones, a lover's gentle touch, only to have Ilara's psychic presence gently pull him back to the cold reality of the ship, the memory dissolving like smoke. Ilara, in turn, was haunted by whispers of peace, echoes of the quiet, seductive lullaby, promising her an end to the noise, an end to the pain of being. Kyle would have to reinforce her mental walls, reminding her of the burning anger and defiant love that was the true source of her power. The quiet wasn't fighting them with force. It was trying to wear them down, to dissolve their resolve with illusions of what they had lost or what they could gain, eroding the very why of their mission. It's a filter, Alara said one day, as they watched a nebula that looked like a smear of wet paint slowly fade from existence on the holographic display. It's testing us. It doesn't understand resistance. It only understands desire and cessation. It thinks if it offers us a perfect memory or a perfect peace, we'll stop. It thinks we're just noise that wants to be quiet. So we have to be louder, Kyle replied, his voice grim. We have to be a noise it can't ignore. They began to train, not her power, but their synergy. They would sit in the interface chairs, not to travel, but to practice. Kale would build a complex mental construct, a memory, a feeling, a philosophical concept, and she would learn to wrap her power around it without shattering it, to use his focused intent as a vessel for her infinite storm. He taught her about his world, the one before the static, showing her the vibrant, chaotic, messy reality of old Earth. He showed her art museums, rock concerts, crowded marketplaces, libraries filled with millions of conflicting stories. He filled her mind with the beautiful, illogical noise of humanity. In return, she taught him about the nature of reality. She showed him how to perceive the quantum foam, the raw code of existence that underpinned everything. She let him feel the universe from her perspective, not as a collection of objects, but as a single, infinitely complex thought, constantly thinking itself. He saw that the silence wasn't an invading force. It was the universe's own self-correcting mechanism, an immune system treating life and consciousness as a fever that needed to be cooled. They weren't fighting an enemy. They were fighting the fundamental nature of existence itself. The final leg of the journey was through the Oort cloud, a scattered, ghostly halo of primordial ice and rock at the very edge of the solar system. Here, the laws of physics were frayed threads. Virgil's reports became increasingly erratic. External reality index at 0.14 and falling. Causality fluctuations detected. Recommend. The AI's voice would trail off into static before rebooting. The incursions became more powerful. Kyle found himself standing in the living room of his old house, the smell of coffee brewing, his daughter's laughter echoing from the next room. His wife walked in, smiling, her eyes full of love, and for a heart-stopping moment, he believed it. He almost stayed. The illusion was so perfect, so complete, that it felt more real than the cold metal of the Odyssey. It was Alara who saved him. She didn't pull him out. She came in with him. Her presence appeared beside him in the phantom living room, her eyes full of a shared sorrow. "It's beautiful. Kale," she projected, her thought a whisper in the warm, sunlit room. "But it isn't real, and the real things are worth fighting for." The illusion shattered, not with a crash, but with a deep, mournful sigh, leaving Kale on the floor of the bridge, tears streaming down his face. "It knows us," he gasped, the words ragged. "It's using our own hearts against us." "Then we have to use them first," Alara said, her voice hard as diamond. Virgil's voice crackled back to life, clear and final. "We have arrived. Trajectory complete. The void is before you." The holographic display shifted. The last of the faint, distant stars vanished. Before them was a perfect, absolute sphere of blackness. It didn't just absorb light, it absorbed space itself. It was a hole in the universe, a patch where the canvas of reality had been scrubbed clean. This was the source, the heart of the quiet. The drive is exhausted, Virgil stated calmly. Hull integrity is beginning to fail under the ontological pressure. You have approximately 10 minutes before the Odyssey ceases to exist. This was it. Kyle and Ilara looked at each other one last time, a silent acknowledgement of the end of their journey. They took their places in the interface chairs. The helmets descended, and they plunged into their shared mind, the ship around them groaning as it began to unravel. He built the vessel for their final shout, the core of their defiant message. It wasn't a complex weapon schematic or a set of coordinates. It was a single, perfect image, built from the shards of his broken heart and the fire of her untamed soul. It was the photograph of his family on the beach. He poured every detail into it, the warmth of the sun, the salty spray of the ocean, the feeling of his daughter's small hand in his, the sound of his wife's laughter. He didn't just build the memory, he built the love that surrounded it. The fierce, irrational, unconditional love of a husband and a father. It was the most human thing he could imagine, a perfect, beautiful flaw in the cold logic of the universe. Ilara saw it, felt it, and understood. She took his perfect, fragile vessel of love and began to fill it with her storm. She poured in the rage of her stolen childhood, the loneliness of her long sleep, the joy of tasting water for the first time, the pain of a world on the brink of erasure. She took all the messy, contradictory, glorious noise of life and consciousness and packed it into that single, loving moment on a phantom beach. The quiet felt them coming. The void before them pulsed. And a final, overwhelming wave of logic and peace washed over the ship. It is pointless. You are a dying flicker. The silence is eternal. Surrender and be complete. Kale felt his resolve waver. The logic was so simple, so pure. But then he felt Ilara's mind next to his, and she wasn't just holding on, she was laughing. A wild, defiant, human laugh. You think love is a flaw, she projected back at the void, her thought not a whisper, but a roar that shook the foundations of their shared mind. You think pain is a mistake. You don't understand a thing. With Kale holding the image steady. A lighthouse in the storm. Ilara unleashed everything. She didn't just shout no. She shouted yes. Yes to pain. Yes to love. Yes to chaos. Yes to memory. Yes to every beautiful, illogical, imperfect piece of existence. She took the photograph, now blazing with the power of a supernova, and shouted it into the heart of the void. The final shout was not a sound. It was a story. It was the story of a man who loved his family, a story of loss and grief, a story of a woman who was a storm, a story of a species that refused to be quiet. It was a single, defiant, beautiful note of noise injected into the heart of eternal silence. The backlash was absolute. The Odyssey vaporized instantly. Kyle and Ilara's minds, entwined at the epicenter of a reality-shattering event, were obliterated. But their shout, their story, traveled on. It struck the heart of the quiet not as a weapon that destroys, but as a seed that grows. It introduced a new variable into the eternal, sterile equation of the universe, a beautiful, illogical, and utterly unbreakable piece of noise. The shout did not detonate, it bloomed. In the silent, absolute void where the quiet held its court, a seed of impossible color and warmth took root. The story of Kale's family, infused with the totality of Ilara's existence, became a concept bomb. It didn't attack the quiet with force, But with a paradox, it couldn't resolve the logic of love, the reason of grief, the undeniable existence of a beauty born from imperfection. For the first time in eons, the vast, ancient consciousness of the universe encountered a thought it couldn't categorize, a piece of noise it couldn't simply erase because it was intrinsically, fundamentally true. Back on Earth, the effect was instantaneous and profound. It wasn't a wave of energy or a flash of light. It was a deep, resonant hum that vibrated not in the air, but in the soul of every living human. It was the echo of the shout, the final, fading note of Call and Alara's song. The static, which had been a creeping fog for years, vanished in a single, clean moment. Like a fever breaking, memories, sharp and painful and precious, rushed back in. People fell to their knees in the corridors of the Neo-Denver Anchor, weeping not for what they had just remembered, but for the agonizing years they had been forced to forget. The names of lost loved ones, the faces of erased friends, the taste of food from cities that no longer existed. It all came back in a tidal wave of restored history. The hush, the psychic whisper of the quiet, was silenced, its seductive logic shattered by the triumphant, irrational noise of restored memory. General Rostova stood in the command center, her granite-like composure finally cracking as she stared at a flickering photograph on her console, a picture of a smiling young man in a flight suit. A son reality had stolen from her a decade ago, a son she now remembered with searing, painful clarity. The war was over. They had won. But it wasn't a victory that brought parades and celebration. It brought a global, collective mourning, a shared grief for a world and a people that had been mutilated. Humanity was whole again in its mind, but the scars on the planet and in its history were real and deep. The erasures were not reversed. Buenos Aires was still gone. The Siberian towns, the coral reefs, the billions of lives excised from the timeline remained excised. The shout had not rewritten the past. It had secured the future. It had taught the universe a new rule that this particular strain of noisy, chaotic life was not a flaw to be corrected, but a permanent and protected variation. The silence was not destroyed. It receded. It pulled back to the deep, dark places of the cosmos. Its fundamental purpose altered. It would still be the cosmic janitor, the eraser of failed stars and dead galaxies, but it now carried within its core a new, unerasable piece of data, the memory of a man, a woman, and a storm of defiant love. Humanity was left alone, bruised and battered, standing in the quiet aftermath of a war for its own existence. The years that followed were not easy. They were the years of the Great Remembrance, a time of rebuilding not just cities, but identities. Generations had been born into the twilight of the static, knowing nothing but a fraying, uncertain world. Now they had to learn their own history, to connect with a past that was suddenly, vividly real. Archives were unsealed, stories were told, and the names Kyle and Ilara became the cornerstones of a new global mythology. They were not remembered as soldiers, but as the keepers of noise, the shouting saints, the two souls who had faced the void and taught it how to feel. In the heart of what was once Neo-Denver, a new city began to rise, and at its center, they did not build a monument of stone or steel. They built a garden. In the middle of the garden, they placed a single, simple, unadorned bench overlooking a small, quiet pond. It was a place for people to come and sit, to remember, to tell stories, to add their own small, precious noise to the world. And sometimes, the old ones who remembered the dark times would swear that on a quiet afternoon, if you sat on that bench and listened closely, you could almost hear the faint, distant echo of a child's laughter and the gentle, rhythmic roar of a peaceful ocean. Humanity had found its voice again. It was a voice scarred by loss and tempered by a cosmic fire, but it was unwavering. They continued to explore, to build, to dream, to create their messy, beautiful, illogical art and science. They pushed outwards into the solar system and beyond, not with the arrogance of conquerors, but with the quiet confidence of survivors who had earned their place in the universe. They knew the silence was still out there, a vast and watchful presence in the dark, but they were no longer afraid of it. They understood that the universe was a balance of sound and silence, of story and blank page. Their purpose was not to conquer the silence, but to fill their page with a story so vibrant, so full of love and pain and defiant joy, that the silence itself would have no choice but to listen. Generations passed. The story of the static and the silence, of Kale and Alara, became a sacred text, a reminder of the price of their existence. And then, one day, a deep space probe, exploring a previously uncharted nebula billions of light years from home, sent back a single, impossible image. It was a photograph of a newborn star system coalescing out of the cosmic dust. At its heart was a brilliant, blazing sun, and orbiting it were 9 planets. And on the 3rd planet from that sun, a world of impossible, vibrant blue and swirling white. Geological scans detected a startling anomaly, a single, perfect stretch of coastline, with fine, white sand and gentle, rolling waves. It was a place that shouldn't exist, a geological feature with no natural explanation. But to the handful of historians who saw the image, it was as familiar as their own faces. It was the beach from a photograph that had saved the world. The shout had not just been a message, it had been an act of creation. In the heart of the void, Kull's love and Ilara's power had not died. They had become a new Genesis, a promise whispered into the fabric of space-time. They had planted a garden in the desolation, a new cradle for a new kind of noise. Humanity was not alone anymore. They had sent their story into the stars, and the universe, in its own vast and silent way, had begun to write a reply.